On today's show, we tackle the term being courageously uncomfortable and how that relates to living a life of fulfillment.
Welcome to the Mastering Fulfillment podcast, where we focus on bridging your success with fulfillment in your personal, business, and spiritual life. And now your hosts, Scott Berry and Joshua Wenner.
So if you've listened to one of our episodes that we just recorded back in January, we were really tackling this whole idea of goal setting and how it really intersected and intertwined with fulfillment. And today we thought we'd kind of go over some personal accountabilities and just really kind of loosely wrap on how being courageously uncomfortable really intersects with having a fulfilling life. And as me and Josh were talking about a few weeks ago, how as we start this new year, how people are really starting to build some of their intentions and some of their goals, as they start to move forward, take action, and start to step into a lot of these goals, that what it's going to actually entail is actually being uncomfortable. And, I'll ask you this, Josh. Do you think that you can have a goal or have some type of intention that you're looking to kind of bring into your life and not have it encompass some type of uncomfortability to some degree or another?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. And I actually was just having a conversation with the guy. We were talking about accountability. I'm a big believer in accountability and the power of accountability. And he was telling me how he was really focused on his health and he was already doing it. And I'm like, okay, well, if you're already focused on your health and you're already doing the action steps, then you shouldn't focus on that for accountability. It's like I think the main benefit of when you talk about uncomfortability is things that take courage. Courage actually comes from the Latin word cor, C-O-R, which means heart, and courage, I think that's the way they pronounced it, was a French term, and it actually meant heart rage. So it's interesting. It's like courage of the heart means, do I have the courage to go into these areas of developing myself where I may have been avoiding or putting off or not doing? So a perfect example could be when it comes to goal setting. How many people talk about writing a book, or they talk about creating a podcast, or they talk about losing weight, or they talk about making more money, or they talk about creating a relationship or getting out of a relationship? There's so many areas of life. And when we talk about having a fulfilled life, if you've been talking about it and you've been talking about it for a period of time and you haven't been doing it, then I would suggest that it means you're not willing to get uncomfortable. So exactly what we're talking about is, in order to live an amazing, fulfilled life, a lot of it takes radical, courageous uncomfortability to do those things. Because if they were easy, everybody would do them.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I do think that it takes uncomfortability to really have a level of fulfillment, because fulfillment comes almost when we grow. I believe a deep part of fulfillment is growth, tied to growth.
Yeah.
And a large part of growth is when you don't know something, you have to get uncomfortable. And then as you start to learn it and through that uncomfortability, you grow as a human. And I think that's what provides fulfillment. It's almost like movement. It's like motion creates emotion. It's a form of motion that creates the emotion of fulfillment.
Yeah. I think as me and you have, we've really been students really dissecting this whole idea of fulfillment. And, it's such a broad spectrum of what that actually means. But there are, I believe, some really core principles. And one of that is growth equals life, and ultimately growth equals fulfillment. And I think that if you really ask any people that you would see in your world, whether they're, I guess, intimately in your life, or if they're someone you look up to, like a Richard Branson or whatnot, that they live some type of life continuously where they're always engaging themselves into some type of growth and some type of uncomfortableness, to where they're always kind of stretching themselves. But I think this whole idea of growth equals life, and then ultimately that growth equals fulfillment, that all of that really kind of goes hand in hand. And I think if you really kind of step back and you look about, okay, what are the people that just seem really happy or really content and just seem to really feel this sense of where their life is going, and they feel really strong and connected to it. I would imagine that if you really had those conversations dissected to the core level of what that is, a lot of that has to do with growth. And, there's this really great saying that there's no growth without being uncomfortable. So, one of my goals, it's funny that I'm thinking about this right now, that one of my goals, oh God, I think this was in 2008 or 2009, when I really started to get into this concept. One of my mantras for the year was being comfortable with uncomfortable. And I know that's kind of cliche and it kind of gets tossed around a little bit, but it's really tough. And when you can really get into, I guess, the muscle of it and start to flex that muscle of being okay without being, being okay with being uncomfortable, it helps you move through that uncomfortability a little bit faster. And I think also what it does is it's kind of this guidepost of like, wow, okay, I'm trying to grow, I'm trying to move through something, I'm uncomfortable. I don't know if the uncomfortability ever feels good, but you're able to step through it regardless. And there's kind of this almost this satisfaction of, even though it feels uncomfortable, there's this satisfaction of, wow, okay, I must be growing because it is uncomfortable and I am kind of moving in the direction I want to go, even though it doesn't feel good. It's like that medicine that you take, and it's, you take a spoonful of it and it tastes like shit, but there's some satisfaction in it because it's like, okay, in a few hours or a few minutes, I'm going to feel much better because the medicine's going to start to work, even though it tastes like shit going down, or it tastes terrible going down. And, as we start to move forward into 2018, one of the things that really spawned this whole idea of being courageously uncomfortable is I was, starting to look at some of my own intentions and some of my own goals. And if you go back to the last podcast of goals and fulfillment, one of my big things was when we got back from our dream trip and we were gone for 4 months, I had felt a little disconnected on the relationship pillar of my life. Now, my intimate relationship with Michelle had felt very close, excuse me, but my societal community relationship pillar had felt very weak. And so since the last time we recorded that podcast, I made a commitment myself to have 100 conscious conversations, and just to kind of like put my feet to the grindstone, I went ahead and put out a landing page on my website, and just to kind of like stake it to the world. And I've been like actively reaching out to people that I either know and I hadn't connected with in a while, and I'm looking to re-engage into those conversations, and to also people who I may have met briefly, or they were friends of friends, and I have been really, really being proactive on reaching out to them. And at first it was like, okay, yeah, I'm going to go out and, it's going to be great. I'm going to have these conversations, and who knows where it'll go. They're all about Skype or lunch dates, nothing too intense, but I'm letting the possibility of letting them grow and deepen. But the whole idea of me just going out and reaching to it, was like, okay, I'll go ahead and do it. But when I actually had to start writing the emails and I had to start, picking up the phone to call some of my friends, I think I even got a couple referrals from you as well, Josh, that I realized it wasn't as easy as I thought. And I felt some of this anxiety starting to creep up. And I realized just how uncomfortable it was. And not only necessarily just kind of reaching out, but I just realized that all of the shit that kind of came to surface in my head that that all kind of came up as I was doing that. Like, wow, am I bugging people? Do people even like to get phone calls anymore? Do they feel I'm going to be pitching them with something? And so I had to really get comfortable with my own self to say, look, I've got a lot to give. And I almost had to kind of pep talk my way up in making these conversations. And half of the people that I actually reach out to, if not 60 to 70%, I had already known and I had already had a relationship with, but I hadn't nurtured some of these relationships either because we just kind of grown apart or we moved to different cities. But it was just really interesting to see what came up for me as far as all of the anxiousness and uncomfortability. I thought it was going to be a pretty big cakewalk, but I found out that it was a lot more challenging, and it's also been a lot more rewarding as I'm starting to move through this process. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, that's amazing. What would you say when you are challenging yourself to be uncomfortable? Which parts of it? You said the phone call part. Are there other pieces that are uncomfortable that you have to find the courage to reach out with on the follow through? Like what guides you through it? What allows you to push through it?
So for me, I think it was even a shock that some of this uncomfortability had even come up for me. And so as I started to make calls, I realized what was coming up in my body. I realized the anxiousness that was coming up. I realized the stories that I was telling myself about whether they even wanted to be received from me, whether they even wanted to hear from me and whether I'd be bugging them. And so I had all these kind of stories that come up. And I think to get back to your question of, what helped me kind of get through that is me going back to the why of why I was actually doing this. And for me, it was being able to connect with somebody on a really deep level, and then the opportunity, I guess, both on a two-way street for me to add value to somebody else, and to me to also receive value from somebody else. And so, for me, it was having to remind myself that I was going into it as a really win-win proposition, and using this as an opportunity for me to grow my network, to have the availability to promote my gifts a little bit more, and to really find out what some of the people who I had either looked up to, or I'd wanted to connect with, or I hadn't heard from in a while, how can I help them? And if it aligned, how could I really be able to find out what's going on in their world and to be able to maybe support in any way I can. So I think for me, it was just kind of getting back to the why of like, okay, why am I actually doing this thing called 100 Conversations? 100 Conscious Conversations is because it just looks good and it's just something to do. For me, it was, okay, how can this really propel, my gifts and then possibly help somebody else's gifts in the process? And so for me, it was just kind of reminding myself of that very thing.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really a key distinction. And, if we say distinction, I've had a number of people say they didn't know what distinction meant. Distinction is just a light bulb, or it just means a light bulb moment, something of like an aha moment. So I think a key distinction is when we're moving towards something, we start to notice in our body. So again, you have a goal. Your goal was to get out and meet new friends and new connections. Somebody else's could be to go to the gym. Could be to make more money. And in order to make more money, a lot of times if you're selling something or getting new clients, there's the same things we come up against. If it's dating and partnership, it's the same thing. We're out meeting new people. And those same stories come up that try to kind of take you out. It's almost like the head stories. And I think those head stories are the ones that kind of stop us. And so I really liked what you said of moving into the heart, feeling where there's discomfort, and the stories that were there, and then also pushing through it by focusing on a new story or a new outcome that was empowering you.
Right. Well, and I think that's where all the uncomfortability comes from, it usually comes from the stories that we're telling ourselves. The fact of me having to actually pick up the phone and actually connect with people, that actually wasn't that hard, but it was all the internal kind of mind chatter that I had about the entire process. And I think that was really tough. And, I think you can really apply this to so many spectrums, starting your own business. You are going to run in a ton of uncomfortable moments. And I think that's why there's a lot of entrepreneurs or freelancers or people that are just starting their own business where they get really enthralled with the idea of being their own boss, producing XYZ widget or producing this service that's going to be of immense value for people. But it's the uncomfortability of the skill sets that they don't have and all of the other things that they have to do in order to support that business, which maybe isn't necessarily something that they love to do or isn't one of their strongest skill sets. That seems to be one of the biggest deterrents of success in any type of entrepreneur, if you will. It's the setting up the the tax IDs and getting the accountants and all the other background stuff that's used to support. But I think it all really stems from, getting outside of the story that you tell yourself and then coming back to, okay, what is the why? And then really focusing on the why. And I really believe that when you focus on not even just a mental focus, but like really feeling like, what does it feel like when I produce that widget? What does it feel like when I connect with that person? What does it feel like when I finally get married if you're looking for partnership? What does it feel like when I finally have, if you're trying to have a family, that first child, second child, or eighth child, or whatever it happens to be, like, what does that feel like? And I feel like that helps you get through some of the hurdles.
I totally agree. And I'd say also, sometimes the feelings we're feeling are, if we focus on the feelings, so it's an interesting topic because sometimes the heart will tell us what we need to do and we don't feel like doing it because there's fear or there's things that come up. And other times so it's almost like sometimes in following the heart and being courageous and going like, you're like, I really want friendships. And I've been hearing myself tell this a long time. I feel like I need to go put myself out there. There's fear. And so sometimes that fear, it's the fear that we need to break through. It's the stories that we need to break through. And other times it's the resistance trying to take us a different direction. And, sometimes we're like, oh, I want to make this money and there's this job. I'll give you an example. There's this job and sometimes you're seeing, well, this is the way to do it. And I feel like sometimes the heart is like, well, there's another way to do it. And so sometimes I think it's us learning to feel is really a skill set that I think it needs to be practiced to learn, okay, when is it my fear that I need to overcome and get outside my comfort zone? And when is it actually my heart, if you will, guiding me in a different direction? And my head is thinking I need to do something, but it's actually not what I need to do. It's like I've seen a lot of people go out and they'll just literally hit their head and do the same thing over and over and over again because they're like, this is how I'm going to get from A to B. And they can get there, but it's a very like trudging through the snow, trudging through the muck area. And they could have just taken a different direction and it been light and effortless. So I think this is a really interesting again, when it comes to fulfillment, what is fulfillment? And when do you need to be courageous with fulfillment? When do you need to feel into your heart what you need to do and overcome some uncomfortability and get out your comfort zone? Because that's where all the growth is. And that could also look like not doing what you think you need to do, right? Sometimes the uncomfortability is in the surrender of like, wow, I'm going to totally surrender this for a moment. And the plan I had, the strategy I had, the thing I've been fighting for, whatever that may be, sometimes it's about the breakthrough. And sometimes it's literally about I'm going to just surrender and turn it over to God or spirit or the universe or whatever you believe created us, creates nature. And I'm going to trust and have faith and I'm going to follow where it's guiding me or leading me. And so I think there's a discernment there and it's kind of a teeter-totter between the two. And I think the only way to discover it is our own discovery process of learning, oh, that's fear and that is resistance. Or I guess you should say, it's like this is the flow of the river. And if you maybe fear could be like the pools on the side of the river that just keep us stuck around the pools. and we're afraid to go down the river, but the river's down there. And it's like, okay, I can sit around this pool forever looking at the river. And sometimes I just need to, get strong enough to get outside the river, and it's uncomfortable to get back in that current because I don't know where the river's going to take me. And so I can either go down that river, or sometimes we're trying to get out of the little side pool and we're trying to swim upstream because we're resisting going with the flow. That might be an interesting metaphor of like, oh, am I just saying, oh, here's the river, go down it, and I'm just caught in a little side whirlpool, or am I actually trying to go uphill and it's the wrong direction, and and it feels heavy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it almost sounds like, given that example of, doing that one thing in that one person who's trudging and trudging and trudging that same direction, it's almost like, sometimes in our head we feel like, okay, the best way to get from point A to point B is actually to go up river instead of just kind of like surrendering and allowing yourself into a different direction. It's like, oh, it would be much more, easeful if we were to go downstream. But I guess in our mind, we never saw that as a possibility. We kind of mapped out the how, but it didn't align with what that initial projection looked like. And so I guess I'm wondering, so for that person who's so, has their blinders on and they're kind of like moving in one direction and they're, like you say, just really like trudging through the mud, what is it about that mindset that's maybe keeping them or allowing them to really be, I guess, open and a little bit more free flowing to going into a different direction or open to something else? Would you say it's uncomfortability, or would you say it's just a story that they have, or what would you say that, that is stopping that person from allowing other possibility to come in?
Yeah, great question. I'm thinking of I'm trying to think of an example that would portray, because when the discernment, maybe there's two different examples. When a discernment is, I like your example of, I want to meet new friendships. I'm feeling like I want to cultivate new friendships and I haven't been developing them. I'm feeling this need. So I got to get outside my comfort zone to go develop those and create that, kind of get that energy flowing. And I think the contrast is, I'll take up one of the guys in my recent retreats. He's had a story about money forever, if you will. And, I hear what for him, his story is he keeps getting busy. So he takes on project after project after project, and none of the projects really pan out the way he wants. And when I actually talk to him at the end of the day, how would I describe it? He's trudging uphill, but he's not really trudging, if that makes sense. He's trudging uphill, but he's not being uncomfortable. He's not making the calls. He's not doing some of the things that he needs to do. And I think in that case, the trudging is more the story. It goes back down to the same story of why he's not where he wants to be or why he doesn't have the energy.
Well, it sounds in that story, he's almost to a point where he's filling himself up with a lot of busy work, but he's actually not making a lot of progress for whatever reason. And I know some people, especially entrepreneurs, will do this all the time, where we'll sit and we'll create a lot of busy work to make ourselves feel fulfilled, but we realize we're not actually moving in a direction that's actually getting us to where we want to go sometimes.
So yeah, that's okay. So on that point, that's a great distinction. Is it's really busy. It seems like we're doing a lot of movement, but we're not going anywhere. So it feels like we're trudging through the water, but really the uncomfortability is to pick up the phone and make calls to enroll new clients or build new connections is what he's resisting. And instead he's spending all this time doing all these other tasks. And instead then he gets to sit in the fear of not having the money and use that story over and over again, right? Instead of doing something about it, getting uncomfortable, building momentum, and taking action on the thing that he's most uncomfortable about. So I think one of the distinctions or one of the differentiators can be trudging is when you're not really feeling. I think trudging is when you're in your head and you're not feeling, because I think as we practice feeling and getting in the body, it'll tell us where to go. It'll tell us where what'll move the needle and where we have resistance to do it.
Right. Yeah. And I also think a lot of that busyness is like a protector. It almost keeps us from the uncomfortability. It almost allows us to not have to think about looking at something different that might be uncomfortable. Let me ask you this. In that example, do you think it sounds like he might have been aware of it afterwards? But I know a lot of times we start pushing one direction, and we don't even realize that we're doing it. Right. It's kind of a subconscious thing. It sounds like he may have had the awareness later, but I'm curious if you think he was aware of it even before that.
I actually thought of a totally, as you were saying that, I got another example of another man who I see a similar pattern but different in him. He wants to create, he has this vision of what he wants to create, and he's been saying it to me for probably 10 years. Like, I've known him for a long time. And when he comes out, he always thinks his energy is like breakthrough energy. So it's a perfect example. He always thinks he needs to push harder, faster, go to the next level, if that makes sense. So he's so focused on pushing through to breakthrough that he's not able to be gentle when it needs to be gentle. And to me, that's exactly what's stopping him, is he's literally made it up in his mind that, oh, you just need to break through. So it's all or nothing. So when it needs to be gentle, there's no breakthrough. It's like, I got to push myself to the point of exhaustion. But if you're not willing to be gentle with yourself, how can you lead other people and know where to be gentle with them, when to push them through and when to be gentle with them? So that's at least what I saw, is that same piece. And I also say a lot of times the uncomfortability, I think it really comes back to the same thing we're saying. Like, it's really hard to push through that uncomfortability. It feels like the void. It feels like the emptiness. It feels like the black sludge, It feels like this like heavy thing that we're trying to do when we're trying to create an area of our life, or if it wasn't, we would have already have created it.
Right. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. We would have done it if it wasn't heavy. Good point. The fact that it's heavy is because we're trying to do it. And if it's been there for a long time, then what ends up happening is then we stack the story. So whatever story we create of why we didn't achieve it gets stacked. And now we have this huge story. So not only are we doing that, but we're also having to surrender the story now that's stacked upon it of like, oh, is it just that I just didn't get outside my comfort zone? Right? I don't have the money I want, or the body I want, or the relationship I want because I wasn't willing to get uncomfortable and push past that. So sometimes I think in not wanting to accept that, I think we end up continuing to play out the same patterns and continuing to stay stuck because it's safe. Again, it's like we're in this side whirlpool and it goes, I don't know what's downriver. Let's say getting in shape would be trusting the river, going down the river. But I also think in any new area of growth, there is the uncomfortability, like you mentioned previously. So I think that's it. It's like we want to do something, we figure out where we want to go, and then we have to trust and be willing to get uncomfortable in order to do it, because it's a new skill set we have to learn. We haven't learned it yet. There's something when it talks about learning, and there's 4 levels of learning. They talk about unconscious uncompetence, unconscious competence, conscious competence, and then unconscious competence. So it's basically moving from the unconscious to the conscious. And they give an example of growing where, Tony Robbins gives this example where you're going through life and you're tripping all the time would be unconscious uncompetence, like that person that doesn't know what they don't know. And they're walking around, they're tripping, they don't even know why they're tripping. And then all of a sudden at some point you move into conscious uncompetence, meaning you're incompetent with something, but you're consciously aware of it. Like, okay, why am I tripping? I keep tripping everywhere. I'm noticing that I'm tripping, and I'm looking around and you're like, oh, everybody's got their shoelaces tied and mine are untied. And that's when the awareness, the consciousness is the awareness of it. And then we move into conscious competence, that's when we're tying our shoes. And as we're practicing tying our shoes, it's like we're very focused on what we're doing. Our tongue's out of the side of our mouth. It's like it takes every effort just to tie the shoes and put the loop and, go around the tree and that whole metaphor. And then now, when was the last time any of us thought of tying our shoes? It's unconscious competence, meaning we're competent at it, but it's an unconscious thing that we just do. And so with that example, anything new that we're trying to grow, whether it's building friendships, whether it's dating, whether it's making money, whether it's growing in personal development, I think, any of these different areas of life, unless you've been developing that skill set, we always have to grow. And in the beginning, there's always the unconscious uncompetence. And I think it's around those areas on the unconscious competence area where it's the most uncomfortable, because I think that's when we're like moving from a place of unconscious to conscious. And then as we start to notice in reference of where we're at to other people, I think that's where we tend to judge or we tend to compare ourselves. And I think that part can get a little bit tricky because as we're judging and comparing ourselves to other people, that's when we can feel like we should be somewhere faster than we are. And when we start to feel like that, that's when it's like we can self-sabotage before we ever got started. Yeah, absolutely.
This whole thing about, conscious competence and unconscious competence, just the awareness of, I guess, being an actual co-creator in your life, right? And, there's this really great story that really frames this whole idea of fulfillment, and it really frames this whole idea of, success without fulfillment is one of the ultimate failures. It reminds me of the story about Cary Grant, and he was this very famous movie star, probably about a half a decade ago. And what a lot of people don't know is he also used to do a lot of theater work in Broadway. He had this one show where he went out and he killed it, and standing ovation, got back for another standing ovation, brought him back. So he did 2 or 3 or possibly even 4 encores. I think it was actually 3 encores, and people were just up in arms, throwing roses on the stage, and they were just absolutely going wild. I mean, he just killed it. And so after the show, one of his managers actually walked back to Cary's dressing room, and to his dismay, he opens up the door, and Cary was like throwing something on the ground, and he was cursing to himself, and he was so upset. And his manager was just shocked. He's like, what is going on? He's like, that was one of the best performances I've ever seen. He's like, why are you so upset? And Cary turned around and he looked at him and he's like, I know I was great. He's like, but I don't know why. And so a lot of times when we end up creating these, I guess, successes in our lives, and we end up creating all this great environment around us, but we're not exactly sure why we're doing it. There's sometimes this level of, I guess, uneasiness, if you will, because you're not exactly sure what it takes to bring in fulfillment into your life. Like, you just happen to kind of stumble upon it. And then, when you start to learn the laws of the universe and you start to kind of align with some of these aspects, you can start to consciously create your environment. You can start to consciously create what's around you, and you can consciously create your own life and your lifestyle, and you become a creator in your life, and you start to move from being reactive in your life to proactive in your life in so many areas. And I think, for a lot of us, we're very consciously competent in certain areas, and then other areas we're not. But when we can start to have a little bit more awareness in it, it's like, that's when the juices start to flow. That's when things start to rock and roll. And that's when, life starts to get super juicy and super fulfilling. And I can only speak for myself. That's part of my work, is to really moving into that whole conscious competent thing, to a point where, certain things like, just waking up and having gratitude, and, coming home and, literally going straight to my wife to give her a big hug, and creating that muscle memory to where I don't have to start thinking about it. That just starts to really create a life of fulfillment, because I know the core why of why I do those things is ultimately going to be super fulfilling to me.
That's amazing. I love that. I love that. Getting in a way of where we're consciously creating our life and doing it in a way where, because again, even when you first started that, let me ask you a question on that. Even though you love your wife and you guys have an amazing relationship, I was telling you earlier before we got on here that you're one of the 2 relationships that I really, 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 really admire and talk about a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
But when you first started, was it uncomfortable to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. To a point. I wouldn't say it was super uncomfortable, because Michelle, I think, had created a muscle, and I think I had created a muscle in prior relationships to want to do that. I think what the uncomfortability was the routine of it, right? So when you're in a really good state, it's real easy when you're feeling good. I think where the uncomfortability came up was when I'm having a shitty day, when I come home and things just haven't been going right, and you're not really in that mood. How do I still get into that place? That was the uncomfortable part, because ultimately I still wanted to,
But I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's what I'm wanting to point out. Is it's even stuff it's not like the things that we want to do them.
Yeah.
It's the consistency that's the hard part. It's the consistency. We can start off with momentum, and just like you said, it's like the good days and the bad days. But I think what are a couple things that allowed you to step into that even when it was uncomfortable? Was it back to your why and saying, hey, I got to change my state. I got to put myself in a resourceful place. Here's the reasons I got to think about this. Like, let me shift this. Or how did you start to break through those?
It was 100% the why. It was because I was so committed to the relationship, and I knew that starting off that first moment when I got home with Michelle, that literally kind of creates the rest of the dynamic for the whole night. And so I had to keep reminding myself of that. And I was dedicated to having a incredibly fruitful and loving relationship. And I was like, okay, this is my why. And so I had to keep reminding myself, it's like, I love this woman. I want to make sure that the relationship that we have is always dynamic to the best of my ability. And, we always kind of go ups and downs, and we are human, but we have more control over that than I think most people give themselves credit for, and at least more than, what I would give myself credit for. And to me, it was really reminding myself of the why. And I knew that I had to really kind of create that muscle and just remind myself, like, okay, I know I love this woman. Even though I'm in a shitty mood, or even though the last time we may have spoke, there may have been some friction. I keep reminding myself that that's not my default state with her and in the relationship, that our default state is one of like love, compassion, and vibrancy in the relationship. So for me, it's just kind of reminding myself. Now, do I fall down? Abso-fucking-lutely. But the more that I start to flex this muscle, I just get up a lot quicker. And it's easier for me to kind of, move through that, if you will.
That's great. I love that.
Yeah.
That's powerful. So I think that's another example of just being, again, so, for anybody that's wanting to achieve anything or create something or move in a direction, focusing on the why, focusing on who you're going to serve. I think that's super critical. Like who you're going to serve, who you're going to make a difference with first and foremost, and where that why comes in, and then able to do it consistently over a period of time. And then I would also say being gentle if we miss a day or two.
That's a big one.
So sometimes it's like we build so much momentum and we do really good and we start to make progress, and then something happens and throws us off and we miss a day and we beat ourselves up. And sometimes to beat ourselves up, we can push ourselves farther back and almost quit it sometimes because we didn't do it perfect. And so I think, for me, it's like if I'm 90% in this direction, it becomes a pattern. So if I'm 2 steps forward, I take a day off. I'm 3 steps forward, a day off. 4 steps forward, a day off. Like over time, you're continuing to make progress. And over time, it continues to be more of a pattern than not. And then pretty soon at some point, it just shifts and it's part of life. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. And, it's said that your state that you're in, how you're feeling will dictate the actions. A lot of times we're not in a, very fruitful state, if you will. So that, that really dictates a lot of our actions. And so I think this is where you kind of touched on earlier, is the accountability is, when you're not in those states and you don't want to go to the gym, or you don't want to go home and hug your wife, how do you keep yourself on that path? Sometimes it's accountability with somebody else, sometimes it's just remembering the why. I do feel like there's lots of tools for that. Would you say what tools would you say that helps someone kind of keep that muscle going for some of the things that we're looking to do?
Yeah, great question. For me, if they're a man, it's coming to a retreat. But, in general, I mean, the exercises we do, I can share exactly what we do. A lot of it is practicing feeling. I think that's the biggest thing that I'm learning, is how to be present. And I thought I was present before, but I was present when I wanted to be present. And when it got heavy, I would run. Not consciously, but when things got a little heavier, I wasn't able to stand in that heaviness, if you will.
Would you say that's a masculine thing? Would you say that's a kind of a male-oriented thing to kind of like pull away and go into our cave? Or would you say that's kind of specific to you?
I'm actually, it's not only a masculine thing, but I find it's the same with men and women. It's a lot of times it's not just when stuff doesn't go right, but, it's like anytime we feel judgment, comparison, guilt, shame, worry, stress, like all these things are mind, it's head energy. And, from my work of understanding a lot about grief, it's all protecting the heart, and we're trying to protect ourselves from feeling. So I find that for me, when I notice myself in one of those, I'm able to just feel, okay, what's going on? It's like, I'll give you an example, recent example of, even though I do this work, I practice this work, I do a lot of it, my stuff still comes up. And it was a really big opportunity that I got presented with to run a company, and big decision. And I was so like wanting to do everything type of thing. And such a big decision that my default is, I'll notice, and I will say that I hadn't taken a day off in about 3 weeks, a month. So I'd been kind of burning the candle at both ends. And then I just kind of hit a point where I was like, I need to chill. And then my default was food. Ordered a pizza, ordered a Coke, which I don't drink Coke. I hardly ever eat carbs or pizza, and watched a movie. And it was just a day that I've now learned to go. So for me, it's like I learned to go with it. That would be an example of resisting versus going with it. When I was resisting, I was still working, but I could feel the energy building beneath. And it was just like, and I was almost avoiding. And then the day that I confront it, I kind of go into it and I go with the emotion. And then in my past, that could have been a week where I kept repeating that pattern of like eating or watching. But this time when I do it, I allow myself to go there. And then instead of judging or shaming or beating myself up, which is what I did in the past, that's why I'm able to even talk about it and embrace it and not try to hide it, right? It's part of my imperfection, if you will. And I'm okay with it, is that it's a part of me that I would go, oh, okay, what am I protecting? What is this feeling that I'm trying not to feel? And then if I allowed myself to feel beneath that, I'm like, oh, I feel there's big decisions. I don't want to let people down. I don't want to feel rejection. I don't want to feel a sense of not enough. I don't want to feel, these deep core wounds, if you will. And so then if I allow myself just to acknowledge those, to feel them, to be with them, and then describe them. So to me, it's moving from a place of head. So think of like guilt, shame, back to the story. So I think this is where it gets interesting. A lot of times in order to break through something, we create a story of the why in order to push ourselves through, right? So we imagine the story, and that story is what drives us. Well, the challenge is sometimes those same stories don't come true, or they don't always pan out. So there's a heartbreak. So for example, I was in the midst of a decision of this vision I had for my life, which could come true from taking path A, let's call it, of this vision I'd had for many years of making money and doing these different things and building companies. And here this decision is to do it, and feeling in, is it really that I need to step in this direction? And when I actually allowed myself to feel all those feelings, what I felt was that it wasn't in my highest excitement. So the irony was, here I might have, in the past, I would have broken through and tried to find a way to do it all, if that makes sense. And in trying to do it all and trying to push through and not practicing feeling and just saying yes, I would have probably sacrificed a lot of the stuff that I've been building. A lot of the things that are really meaningful to me, I would have sacrificed to build somebody else, because that vision I had of my future was so big. And in surrendering the mind and stepping into the heart and allowing myself to feel, I was like, oh, I allowed myself to feel my core wounds. I allowed myself to acknowledge what they felt like. And there's actually neuroscience now that proves, actually, when we move into sensation, so this is interesting. It's like when it's heady, when we're actually describing story, it's in the head. It's in a certain place in the brain. When we move into describing sensation, like, oh, it feels rough around the edges, or the sensation feels like a circle above my belly button, or whatever the sensation is, but think feeling sensation. And as you're describing sensation, it is. It's the feeling. So if you were to say, okay, I'll give you an example. Let's say, well, in the same example, it was like I was craving food and I was craving relaxing, but I wasn't quite feeling yet. So by the time I ordered I just kept feeling like I'm hungry, I'm craving a pizza, right? So I wasn't quite allowing myself to feel. I was just acknowledging what was showing up, and then I did it. And then, of course, it state changed it, but then I could really feel, because I could feel uncomfortable. But part of that is in just the feeling, in the sensation. What happens is it changes the energy. It's almost like we're acknowledging what's there. And as we acknowledge what's there and as we feel it, it actually moves to a different part of the brain. And the different part of the brain, it's the present moment. In the present moment, things come and things go. There's no, it doesn't stay. It's the mind and the stories that we have tied to the mind and that vision. That's what stays. It's the stories. So the stories are future. So, and that's the tricky part. The tricky part is sometimes we create these stories. Like, you have a beautiful story of the relationship you want to create with your wife. So you allow yourself to push through some of these things in order to create that, those routines, those habits that are going to bring you fulfillment. Yet other times, sometimes the stories in our head are telling us to swim upstream. And I think this kind of ties it all in. And sometimes we need to practice feeling, and sometimes the feeling will be like, what feels good? And for me, I was like, right now I work for myself. I have my own lifestyle. I'm my own boss. I love what I do. It's transformation work. It all feels amazing. So I just started to feel, and it felt really light. It felt really flowing. I started to think about this other direction, even though it has let's say a huge opportunity for a really big payout within the next 12 to 18 months. It felt heavy. And I started to be like, oh, this is feeling heavy. But there's a lot of people that I wanted to get their affection, if you will. So I had to realize like, oh, I have to risk, and this is where it was courageous, I have to risk not taking this opportunity or changing this opportunity and risk rejection, if you will, and be courageous in that and get uncomfortable in that in order to honor myself. So in the past, I would have chosen the opportunity and not honored myself in order to not be rejected and in order to meet that vision that I had in my future. And then ultimately I would have been unhappy. So I guess a long-winded way of answering your question is I feel like when things come up, how do we practice feeling? And I think men, just because I've been doing a lot of men's retreats, but I talk to a lot of women that have shared they have similar things that come up. I think we move into the head to avoid feelings. So my advice would just be like, when you notice yourself in judgment, when you notice yourself in comparison, when you notice yourself in guilt, shame, or even just like heaviness, the void, whatever that void is, like, oh, I know I should do this, but all of a sudden now I'm tired. Or all of a sudden now, I use the example of food or a movie, but there's something stalling you from doing something you know you need to do. And when you observe that, instead of judging it and shaming it like we typically do, when we judge it and shame it, it puts it in a corner, almost like a hidden black box corner, and then we hide from it. And that's what stays elusive. So if you can observe it, but not, instead of shameful or criticizing, instead we're gentle and we go, oh, whatever pattern I'm doing, I'm protecting myself. I'm protecting myself by going to bed. I'm protecting myself by sleeping, by whatever that pattern is, that it's almost like it counterintuitively fights what we need to do to get uncomfortable. And if we observe it, then then it's a sign, an action signal to just feel. What am I feeling? And as we drop into feeling, that's what starts to allow us to be in the present moment. And in the present moment, we can feel sensations, we can feel what's going on, and that'll start to give us direction on where the river's flowing and to follow that flow. And you might say, wow, I need to go this direction and it's going to be radically uncomfortable and I need to break through. And it's just my fear in the way. Or it also gives you clarity to say, you know what? It's not my fear. Like the example I had, it's not my fear to take all this on. It's actually not my highest excitement. And I need to go in this, but I can still be a part of it. So I think kind of integrating pieces of this is, how do we practice feeling, and only us feeling? A lot of people end up asking advice from different friends, which is okay. But one of the challenges I find is when asking different people opinions, you usually get three. You'll get somebody that's for you, somebody that's kind of against the opinion, and somebody in the neutral. And so you're still getting three different perspectives to decide. So it can be a good example of getting clarity, or to have somebody reflect back, but ultimately to make a decision. And I think this is one of our first or second podcasts all about decisions. It's getting back into the heart and really feeling. And the feeling that's where we start to know ourselves. That's what, and I think that's our whole point of our podcast of fulfillment. Fulfillment is for us, at the end of the day, and a perfect example of, I think what you've mentioned a number of times, Scott, of so many people get to the edge of their life and they maybe achieved what they thought was success, and then they're unfulfilled. And so the more we can learn to feel, the more we can learn to tap into what our essence is, the more we learn what we really are, whatever that essence is, and the more we can align with it. And I believe that's what aligns us to get the courage to follow that, to get the courage to get uncomfortable to follow that, even when you may be like, wow, this is my path and I have to have faith and trust this. And that can be radically uncomfortable. But I find that's what brings true freedom. That's what brings true happiness. That's what brings true fulfillment, is following that flow.
Be sure to join us on the next podcast episode for part 2. Visit us at masteringfulfillment.com for other podcasts such as these. Or if you're looking to take your personal fulfillment to another level, feel free to get in contact with either myself or Joshua Winter.